Welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Morgan. I am up until Friday the knowledge broker of the National Environmental Science Program's Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you all for this, our final formal presentation to the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment on behalf of Hub Research. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that I'm coming to you from, and many of you are on today, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra and the surrounding regions, where it is beautiful and we're finally getting that breath of summer coming through the woodlands. So it's great to be here on Ngunnawal country and to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge country all around the Australia where everybody is joining us from today, and to welcome in particular any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. So today we have our final findings presentation for a number of related projects that have looked at the impact of the 2019-20 bushfires on fauna, on vertebrates and invertebrates, on the genetic subpopulations of species, on the numbers of animals, devastated by the fires. This is really a chance for us all to think back and reflect on what we've learnt in the interim since the fires, since that first wave of analyses came through from a lot of the people who are in this room about those initial impacts of those devastating fires, to learn what we can about not just how that it's impacted the species that we're talking about today, and the taxa that have been put forward for listing and many other policy and management responses, but also to really understand what events of this scale can and have done to our wildlife and to our biodiversity, and to really understand and prepare for what that might mean for the future. So this session's going to run, I hope, despite having many talks, I hope to run in a fairly seamless way. Many of these researchers have been working together throughout the course of the last nearly 2 years on this work. And so the first part of the session will really be pulling together the work that's been done to review the impacts on invertebrate species. As many of you know, they're often data poor species. We don't know a lot about the invertebrates. So we're going to be hearing not just about what the analysis showed about the impacts on those species, but about the process of that analysis and how we got there, what kinds of information and what kinds of analyses were done so that we can really understand how to do that in future for whole taxonomic groups that are data poor. And so we'll be hearing from John Woinarski, from Payal Bal, from Jess Marsh and from Libby Rumpff on those different talks, and they'll just pass one to each other. Then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A on the invertebrates themselves, so please do pop your questions in the chat as we go. And also, if you wouldn't mind now introducing yourselves in the chat, letting our team know where you're from in terms of organisation, but also in terms of which Indigenous country you're coming to us from today, as a way of acknowledging country into this space as well. And then, yes, please let the questions flow in the chat, and we'll either call on you to speak to them or I'll read them out during the Q&A. But if you keep them coming as we go, that will give us more time to answer and discuss and think about those answers. In the second half of this meeting, we'll then move to looking at the vertebrate impacts. So we're going to begin that second half with Chris Jolly looking at wildlife mortality, the project attempting to assess wildlife mortality and what we learned from that project. And then Renee is going to be talking us through her work on the genetic subpopulations and what we learned from the genetic taxonomy work that was done. And then we're going to move on to, back to John and to Libby talking us through the assessment of vertebrate species that's been done, the repeated assessments that have been done and where we landed with those. So that's our meeting today. I hope that makes sense, and I'd like to now hand over to John to kick us off for the session on invertebrates.
Thank you, Rachel. Payal?
The screens, I've shared the screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
John?
I will be able to soon. Welcome to my spare bedroom in Wiradjuri country, and I pay tribute to elders past, present and emerging. And I pay tribute also to my colleagues who worked on this project with me. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with Payal, Libby and Jess Thanks, Jess. Next, Payal, next slide. And I'll start with acknowledgements because I think it's a good spot to start. This project was funded through the Bushfire Recovery Fund from the Australian Government, and we've had a lot of ongoing liaison with many people in the department, and I pay tribute to that very much. They've been very helpful. The expert panel also helped guide this project, and there were many others in the team, including Kate, Hannah, Aaron, and Tanya. And as Rachel said, this is the last hurrah of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, so it's a bittersweet moment for us all. It's been a marvellous journey that we've all been on, but all good things come to an end. And talking of coming to the end, it's that time of year when it's we're very grateful for you to actually sit through yet another webinar. So thank you all on the audience. Next, thanks. We might not be able to, you might not be able to memorise everything we present in the next 50 minutes or so. So if you want more information, there's a couple of 100-page report on our Threatened Species Recovery website, which explains this project and gives all the details about our results and conclusions. And with the paper by Jess and others, it's been submitted, and we expect that to be published soon as well. And I'll do a little advanced advertising that we've got a book coming up in the next year or so, which goes through all the impacts of the 2019-2020 fires and the lessons we need to learn from them. So that will be coming up, and it's edited by Libby, me, Sarah Legg, Brendan Wintoul, Stephen Van Leeuwen. Next, thanks. So what we want to do at the end of this project is to actually leave enough information to provide an evidence base for threatened species listing for the most fire-affected invertebrates. We've developed a tray of invertebrate life history characteristics that inform assessment of fire susceptibility, and we'd like to maintain that as a living legacy. We want more recognition for the plight and the conservation needs for invertebrate species generally in Australia. And we want this project to contribute to better management, better recovery, and more preparedness for the future. Thanks. Next. Next. So the central question was, what was the impact of wildfire on the invertebrate species of Australia? Next, thanks, Payal. And next again. So the impact is essentially a measure of the overlap of the species distributional range with fire times the susceptibility of those species to fire. The project sought to, given the huge amount of uncertainty and lack of knowledge about many invertebrate species, we sought to actually explicitly consider uncertainty in our assessment and attempt to deal with it. And we wanted to know essentially what the information our results tell us in terms of listing and management and survey and further research. Thank you. Next. We recognise that the department needed a very quick assessment of the most fire-affected invertebrates as the fires were burning or soon thereafter to help prioritise management responses, and we developed that in April last year. We did it very quickly and urgently to help inform that priority response. And what we've done subsequently in this project was to actually develop or completely overhaul that assessment and listing. So in this project, unlike the initial preliminary assessment, we considered fire severity. We got many more experts involved. We had more data sets. We more considered uncertainty, and we tried much more strategically to assess what the management responses most needed were. Next, thanks, Payal. So there's a series of very broad contextual issues which permeate everything to do with invertebrate conservation, and I'll quickly run through those. There's a huge number of species of invertebrates in Australia. They dwarf the number of vertebrate species and substantially greater than the number of plant species. So it's very hard to deal with so many balls in the air at once. Next. Only about a third of the Australian invertebrates are actually described, have a name, so that makes it really tricky to actually figure out the conservation needs for all those species about which we know almost nothing and which aren't even described or discovered yet. And more likely than not, those undescribed species are rare and restricted and hence of more conservation importance. Next. There's very limited distributional data for most invertebrate species. So if you look at the Australian Atlas of Living Australia, there are only 42 records per individual invertebrate species, whereas there are more than 60,000 for individual bird species. Many of the records are a bit dubious, And because we really don't know exactly the distribution of many of these invertebrate species, it's going to be very hard going back after the fire to figure out whether the species are there or not to survive the fire and to find surviving populations. Next. There's across the world and in Australia generally, there's been a neglect of invertebrate conservation. So far less than 1% of Australian invertebrate species are listed as threatened under the EPBC Act, whereas the 24% of mammals are. So that it's not because those invertebrate species are less deserving of conservation attention, it's simply that data deficiency precludes current listing. And there's also very disproportionately little funding has been directed to Australian invertebrates. And we don't want to perpetuate that problem. So we've really tried to actually bring invertebrates into the sunlight with this project. Next. Many invertebrate species have really, really small ranges, sort of one hilltop or sort of a very small area indeed. So it's quite likely that many of those species may be obliterated in a single fire. Next. There's very little monitoring of Australian invertebrates, so it's very challenging to affect what the impacts of the fires were and to establish a baseline from which we can measure recovery. Next. We don't really know much about the ecology of many of these invertebrate species, so we don't really know whether some species are happy with fire or some species are devastated by it. So the evidence base is very poor. Next. And invertebrates, more than vertebrates, have really complex life histories. So a cicada, for example, may spend much of its life underground and not be at all affected by fire, but its adult stages are clearly above ground. So the impacts of fire on any invertebrate species with such a complex life history are very difficult to actually interpret and measure. Next. Another major information deficiency for invertebrates is we really don't know what their threats are and what their management needs. There's not much evidence that's available at the moment that's been documented. Next. But we do know that invertebrates have very major ecological functions, partly by virtue of their sheer number of species, the diversity of species, the numbers of invertebrates of any particular species, and their really broad ecological range. They have really important ecological functions. So the loss of any of these invertebrate species may well have major repercussions for the rest of the environment. Next. And this is the single species in Australia which is known to have become extinct as a result of the 2019-20 fires. It's the most extraordinarily uncharismatic little white blob you see in the far right corner of this graph, this picture. Banksia montana mealybug, and all known populations of that species were extirpated in the 2019-20 fires. So rest in peace, the Banksia montana mealybug. And this is a seamless presentation, and I'm passing the baton now to Payal. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So everyone, can I be heard fine? Just checking quickly.
You're good.
So I will be talking, going briefly over the data collection and cleaning, and present some of the data characteristics of our cleaned invertebrate data set, and then talk a bit about estimating species ranges. So this is the extent of occurrence for species, which was used in the overlap analysis, and then briefly about the fire overlap analysis and some summary stats there. All our analyses were done using R, and all of this is available freely. So we started off by collecting specimen-only records from ALA, state and museum databases, and some records from private data holders. Specimen-only because it was recognized early on in the project that there is a high level of inaccuracy for observational records for invertebrates in public databases. The data were cleaned following a systematic and repeatable process that dealt with taxonomic, geographic, and other data issues. So for example, we removed marine and exotic species using publicly available checklists and also manually checking the species lists. We removed records with inaccurate geographic information, so missing or invalid coordinates or coordinates falling off land. We checked and where possible corrected species names as well as their class, order, family information. And for this, we use the Australian Faunal Directory taxonomy to identify and remove undescribed species, remove or correct misspelled or misclassified species, or species with incomplete names, and to resolve synonyms. So we also, after referring to the AFT, we also checked species names, lots of the species names manually, and subspecies were retained where these were clearly identified by the AFT. And then finally, we removed spatial duplicates as well as records predating 1990 if there were sufficient data points for a species. This left us with about 350,000 occurrence records across 45,500 species coming from a variety of data sources. Now, it's important to note that the total number of this formed only 40% of the total number of described species, invertebrate species for Australia as per the AFT. So that means leaving more than half or 60% of the species with either no records or records of insufficient data quality to use in any meaningful analyses. Of the 45,500 unique species with usable data, we again see that most of the species have very few data points. So here you see number of species versus the number of records that we had in our cleaned data set. And here we see that 35% of the species had only one occurrence record, about 58% had between 1 to 20 occurrence record, and only 3,000 of those species, so 7% of the data had more than 20 occurrence record. Now it's important to note the 20 records cutoff because it is used as a standard cutoff, although that's not set in stone, for species distribution modeling. We then estimated and mapped the species ranges, so the extent of occurrence, by fitting alpha hull polygons around the occurrence records. Now, to create an alpha hull polygon, we needed at least 3 data points for a species. So that meant that we could only fit an alpha hull and therefore estimate the EOO for half of the species that we had usable data for. The remaining half we could not estimate EO as they only had 1 or 2 data points. Now, something to note here again is that unlike what was done for the vertebrates, we did not model species distributions because, as you will recount, only 7% of the species had more than 20 records. So most invertebrate species do not have sufficient data to fit models to. And then of the total species that we had with usable data, 32,000 had 1 or more records within the preliminary analysis area. And so we focused our analyses on these species from here on. So for these species, we calculated percentage overlap in the fire between the species occurrence and the GBAM fire severity layer by using point occurrence data for all species and the polygons for species, for half of the species that had more than 3 records. Now, as you all know, GBAM layer has 5 fire severity categories going from unburnt to very high severity burns. But there was some uncertainty around GBAM class 2 and whether it included some burnt areas. So to account for this uncertainty in category 2, we calculated the total percentage overlap of a species with fire, first including GBAM class 2, therefore considering it as mildly burnt, and then excluding GBAM class 2, considering it as unburnt. So we took these as the upper and the lower bounds of our estimate, and the best guess was the average of these 2 estimates. We also calculated the percentage overlap for a species only with severe fire, so that meant only using GBAM categories 4 and 5. So for point data, this meant we counted the number of species occurrence points overlapping with each of the fire severity categories. And for polygons, this was the area of the polygon with each category based on a 250-meter resolution grid. What we saw was that over 1,000 species showed at least 50% of their known occurrence overlapping with fire in the study region. The table here tallies the percentage overlap, so going from 50 all the way up to 100%, the total number of species that showed that level of overlap, and of these total number of species, the number of species that had more than 2 records. So this indicates how many of these species we could actually create polygons for, and in the absence of which we only relied on the point overlap estimates. So you will see that of all the species that show 100% overlap, these were known from only 1 or 2 occurrence points. So that means that that for such species, our confidence in their assessment is relatively low. We also tallied the number of species showing overlaps by states or bushfire recovery regions, which are available in the report that John mentioned. Jess will go into detail with these numbers and more, so I'll pass on to her here.
Thanks, Payal. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to start off by talking about the processes we developed to prioritise fire-impacted invertebrate species for conservation assessment and response. I'm also going to turn off my video now to help save bandwidth. So I'll see you after the talk. Okay, thanks, Payal. Can I have the next slide? So Payal's analyses showed us that 14,159 species had part of their range burnt, and 1,209 species were highly fire impacted. So we defined high fire impact as having at least 50% distributional overlap with any severity fire, or at least 30% distributional overlap with high severity fire. And these 1,209 highly fire impacted species were shortlisted for further trait-based vulnerability analyses. Next, please. We also found that 541 species had 100% of range overlapped by fire, and 193 species had 100% of their range overlapped by high severity fire. However, for all these species with 100% fire overlap, they were only known from 1 or 2 occurrence records, and so our confidence that this reflected the true fire overlap for these species is low. Next, please. In addition to the shortlisted 1,209 highly fire impacted species, we also included some additional species. Firstly, we included species which were assessed as threatened under state, federal, or IUCN listings prior to the fire, but which had at least 30% overlap with any severity fire. This is a lower amount of overlap compared to the 1,209 highly fire impacted species. And the rationale for this was that these species had known threats acting on them prior to the fires, and so the impact of the fires are likely to have amplified the species' risks. We also included 19 species that were nominated by experts as being fire impacted and vulnerable as part of an IUCN assessment process, but for which we could either obtain no fire overlap data, or the occurrence data we did have was outdated and underestimated overlap. So next slide, please. Not all species are equally susceptible to fire. Indeed, some species may be favoured by fire. We developed a trait-based vulnerability framework which analyses life history and ecological traits to assess out of these 1,209 highly fire-impacted species, which would likely be at elevated risk, and to use this to prioritise species for response. All traits were gathered from experts or from published sources, and the framework consists of 2 indices, a fire susceptibility index and a recovery risk index. I'll describe these in detail over the following few slides. Thank you. The fire susceptibility index assesses susceptibility of a taxon to fire based on the microhabitat a taxon occupies and its susceptibility to fire. It also takes into account the percent distributional overlap with high severity fire or with moderate to low severity fire of that taxon. We assess traits separately for different life stages where these differed in a species, and we weighted scores by the seasonal likelihood of the species being in that microhabitat at the time of the fire. For example, to take account of species that would likely be in a burrow over summer, but may be above ground the rest of the time, and so would be less susceptible to summer fires. Next, please. Here is a table illustrating a small selection of the microhabitat traits used in the FSI and the scoring system used. Scores shown are the estimated proportion of subpopulations likely to be lost for each habitat, for each microhabitat on impact of mild to moderate fire and of severe fire. This data was estimated using a combination of published sources and consultation with experts. The numbers in parentheses indicate lower and upper bounds for these estimates. For species that occupy a range of microhabitat, scores were averaged. These microhabitat scores were then multiplied by the percent distributional overlap of high severity fire and moderate to low severity fire for each species, again including lower and upper bounds of fire overlap. So for each species, this gave us a score for FSI with a lower and upper bound to reflect uncertainty. Next, please. The recovery risk index encompasses the ability of a taxon to recover post-fire. so its ability to recolonize a burnt area and to survive and reproduce in the altered post-fire ecosystem. We identified 11 trait categories relating to post-fire recovery. Examples of these include dispersal ability, short-range endemism, habitat specificity, host specificity, and physiological tolerance. Within each of these categories, we defined traits which could be assessed for each species. Scores were allocated to each of these traits relating to their influence on the recovery ability of a species, and each species was scored based upon the traits they possess. So next slide, please. So if we look at this table, which summarised scoring for 2 of the trait categories, if you have a look at ecological dependency, the category at the top, you can see the allocation of trait scores. A higher score indicates a greater risk of delayed or incomplete recovery. A species is allocated a score based on the trait it has and for each species, trait scores are again averaged across trait categories to obtain a figure for RRI. Next, please. One of the key challenges to working with invertebrate data in Australia are the substantial data uncertainties. Traits data are no different. To quantify this, we scored traits based on how confident we could be that that trait reflected the ecology of the taxon. A score of confident was given if the trait data was from a published source or expert and relating to that species. Inferred was used if it was inferred using confamilials or congeners, so based on species in the same genus or families as the taxon, and where the trait was not variable in that taxonomic group, or suspected if using confamilials or congeners and there is variability within that taxonomic group in that trait. We also quantified certainty, which was a measure of the average number of traits a species was able to be scored for. For some species, we could gather a lot of trait data and we had greater certainty in our estimation of fire vulnerability, but for some, data was very sparse. Next, please. In this next section of the talk, I'll run quickly through some of the findings from these prioritizations. Next, please. So using scores for the RRI and the FSI, we ranked species in terms of their likely vulnerability to fire, grouping species into categories, so that species that scored highly for both RRI and FSI were ranked as severely vulnerable. The next ones down were highly vulnerable, then moderate vulnerability and mild vulnerability. And all of these species in these categories were classed as vulnerable to fire. Next slide, please. So this resulted in 611 species with elevated vulnerability. These species were spread across 34 different orders, and the orders that had the highest representation of species were Aranii, the spiders, Coleoptera, beetles, Diptera, the flies, and Lepidoptera, which are the butterflies and moths. Next slide, please, Payal. We next folded in consideration of data deficiency and adequacy of knowledge to further prioritise these 611 vulnerable species for conservation assessment, response, and further research. This resulted in 4 categories: likely threatened with good evidence of impact, likely threatened but data poor, possibly threatened but data poor, and possibly threatened but major uncertainties. And the conservation response for these ranged from listing individual species as threatened in conservation management, all the way down to survey and research to fill some of these major data deficiencies. Next, please. So this flowchart illustrates the steps in the process, moving from raw species data in box 1 to shortlisting of fire impacted species in box 2, assessing vulnerability of these species using traits in box 3, and prioritising for action in box 4. We proposed 60 species as likely eligible for assessment under the EPBC Act. This would nearly double the current number of invertebrate species assessed. It is important to note that these 60 species are not necessarily the species at highest risk, but are the ones that we know enough about to allow assessment. For the 209 species with elevated fire vulnerability but insufficient data to allow assessment, survey research and monitoring to provide data on population trends, threats and ecology is critical. An example of such a species is one of the keeled millipedes, Dicladosmela pollex, which is pictured in this flowchart. This is a low dispersing, short-range endemic, heat-intolerant species that lives in moist leaf litter, and most of its known range was impacted by high severity fire. These are all red flags. However, some published sources suggest these millipedes may burrow into the soil during fire and so be relatively resilient to summer fires. For species like this, further research is crucial to assess survival of individuals following fire and also their persistence in the exposed post-fire ecosystem. Next, please, Payal. So here we've got a map that illustrates the distributions of the 60 species prioritised for assessment, showing a wide spread amongst fire impacted areas. Next, please. So within the 60 species prioritised for assessment, we recommend the uplisting of 3 species already assessed under the EPBC Act, including listing the Banksia montana mealybug, Pseudococcus markhavii, as extinct, which John mentioned earlier. 9 terrestrial and 12 aquatic species listed under state and IUCN legislation are also recommended for assessment under the EPBC Act. Next, please. So I'll just say briefly about the IUCN assessment workshop we led. So early in 2021, we joined forces with IUCN to run a workshop to assess a number of fire-impacted invertebrates for the Red List. This workshop was well attended and we assessed 106 species in total, with the input of 66 experts, state and federal government reps. 43 species assessments were published just last week, and the remainder will be published in the next round. Of the 43 species, 34 were assessed as threatened, with 10 being critically endangered. The support of this workshop by experts was brilliant, indicating the willingness of the expert community to support and provide data for assessments. It also provided an illustration of how species-level conservation assessments can be conducted, even for relatively poor data-poor taxa. The data from these assessments are now available to be used to facilitate federal and other assessments of species. Next, please. So we showed that a large number of invertebrate species were impacted by fire. When comparing the distributional fire overlap of invertebrates with that of vertebrate species, we saw that invertebrates comprise 95% of the faunal species in Australia with at least 50% fire overlap and 94% of the species with at least 30% overlap with severe fire. And of course, with this, we need to bear in mind that given the large number of undescribed invertebrate species and the high levels of data deficiency for described species, our figures for the number of invertebrate species impacted are likely an underestimate. It remains a substantial but important conservation challenge to bring the conservation effort for fire-impacted invertebrates into line with the considerable management response for fire-impacted vertebrates. Next, please, Payal. So wherever possible, we have attempted to raise public awareness of fire-affected invertebrates and the conservation challenges they now face. The articles above on screen are just a small selection of the many articles mentioning the work of the team, and media interest and coverage both within Australia and overseas has been strong. Realistically, invertebrates may never receive public or political attention on par with the vertebrates. However, hopefully the tide is changing and people are starting to realise of the importance of invertebrates to us all, are starting to appreciate their vulnerability and the dire need to find a way forward to meaningfully protect them. Our task in this project was to assess the impact of the 2019-2020 fires on invertebrate species in Australia and to draw up a prioritised list of the likely most vulnerable species in need of assessment, research and action. This resulted in 60 species being prioritised for assessment and 209 species being prioritised for further research. Unfortunately, these fires were not an event that will occur in isolation, and with predictions of more frequent and severe fires, it is increasingly important we continue to work towards overcoming the substantial challenges facing invertebrate conservation. The methods we have developed in this project that account for uncertainties and combine analyses of species distribution, fire overlap and traits data to identify and prioritise vulnerable species provide a strong basis for such an approach. Okay, thank you.
And me, seamless. So I'm going to talk on behalf of Hannah Fraser, who did this work, but is on maternity leave right now. So next, thanks, Payal. So as you've just seen this figure, and I'm just highlighting the point at which where we're at now that I'm going to talk about, which is, you know, how do we use this framework to make the next step from vulnerability assessment to help prioritise action, so what we do on the ground. But as you know, as John mentioned, we, you know, after the fires, we were really limited by ability to assess the vulnerability of assessments. The task was huge, the numbers are huge, and the data was really limited. So I think I just wanted to highlight again that, you know, this framework, which is a systematic and robust and transparent sort of prioritisation process for species that builds in a safety net for poorly known species, is a really huge step. And the other thing that Payal and John and Jess have all talked about is different types of uncertainty, and we can now use this framework to really pinpoint which species and the number of species that are subject to different types of uncertainties, and we call those critical because if we don't resolve them, we can't make better decisions. So the bit that I'm going to talk about now is the next step to any vulnerability assessment, which is thinking about, well, how do you then prioritise action? Thanks, Payal. So what, you know, when we when Jess was putting together the vulnerability assessment, as part of that there was a survey, and it was an expert survey where we asked experts for that shortlisted number of species about, well, what are the threats in the short term and what are the threats in the slightly longer term, and we asked them, you know, to be quite specific about that, and then asked them corresponding questions about, okay, well, given those threats, what actions could you apply? I've got this picture of Poirot here. This is John's joke. It's a Poirot shortfall, which is basically the uncertainty that we're talking about here, is we don't understand the threats and what to do about it. So I've got this 1,228 minus 455, because of those species there were, you know, roughly 300 to 400 where people really struggled to assign threats and actions as well. So they're definitely a critical uncertainty there. All right, thanks, Payal, if you could. Thank you. So as part of the survey, as I said, we asked them, you know, what are the top threats, and providing really detailed judgments on these answers about, well, okay, so what's the threat and then what's the resulting population decline? Exact answers is tricky, and so we provided these different categories, and to account for uncertainty here we allowed people to select multiple categories of decline. So for instance, on this first one, more fire was a threat in the short term. It could be as low as a 10% decline and up to a 60% decline. So we did the same thing for actions. So and the question then was, how much do those actions mitigate those declines? And as I said, we incorporated uncertainty. So we ran a Monte Carlo simulation there, which is basically just specifying these uncertainty bounds and taking random draws, because what we were trying to do is say, despite this uncertainty, what do we think the key threats are and what do we think the most effective actions are? Thanks, Payal. So in terms of what the top threats were, and this is across all the species and across the PAA, the fire impacted area, you can see that, you know, on the y-axis there, we've got the number of simulations where a particular threat responded in a particular decline, or was estimated to respond in a particular decline, either a 30% population decline in blue, a 50% decline in orange, or a greater than 80% decline in the population in grey. And you can see that by far, you know, more fire, either in the short term and in the longer term, was considered a key threat. Habitat loss was a big one, and then climate change and drought, and remembering that we did constrain the number of threats that they could specify. Now, this is kind of a bit tricky now, because, you know, you look at some of these threats like climate change, drought, more fire, they're all sort of related, and then what do you do about those things? So thanks, Payal. We asked them, what can you do? And so it's not particularly surprising that the corresponding top actions in terms of how effective they were at mitigating those declines, according to the experts, having tailored fire management strategies tailored to invertebrates was considered to be really important, an important thing to do to deal with that threat. Replanting and restoration was important. And then you can see there's a number of sort of big strategic actions like soil stabilisation and weed control, but some really targeted actions as well to species, such as reintroduction of target species or ex situ conservation and so on. Thanks, Payal. So Hannah then looked at this to say, well, if we're trying to prioritise what you do and where, we need to understand, well, do these patterns change regionally? And so we looked at the different fire-affected regions and those top threats and those top actions. So we're looking at actions now. And the answer is yes, they do. They do vary somewhat. So if we maybe back one. Payal's trying to speed me up. Replanting and restoration, you can see here that, for instance, in West Australia, it wasn't considered a hugely important or effective action, whereas, say, in the Greater Blue Mountains it was. Thanks, Payal. When we look at weed control, most of the regions, it was not a top action for them. But for instance, in Kangaroo Island, it was, but it could be. There's huge uncertainty around that. So I would suggest, there's some indication there about where it's best to target research towards efficacy of actions. Thanks, Payal. And then for tailored fire management, for instance, you can see that Tasmania and West Australia in particular, those regions suggested that was a really effective action to sort of implement. And then for other regions, such as in the Alps and in East Gippsland, it could be, or it might not be. So that, again, it's not so convincing as an effective action. There's huge uncertainty around that. Thanks. Okay, so when we look at how that translated, so all of this work was done after, after the regional fund money was distributed, but you can see too that there was a big focus on those big strategic, or those strategic actions sort of came up as important across many different invertebrate species. And when we look at how that money was distributed across the region, so if you have a look here, the dark cells mean that these were the actions which are on the top there were suggested as they should form part of a management strategy for that region. You can see that, say, fire planning and management and weed control and vegetation restoration were a feature in those regional workshops, things that people thought were important to address priority species, even though invertebrate species maybe weren't such a strong focus of that investment from participants. Thanks.
Right, thanks. It's me again. I'll just turn off. Okay, so I am going to finish off my part today by summarising the recommendations from our project. These recommendations fall under two broad categories. Firstly, we have recommendations to facilitate the conservation of species identified in our report as being substantially impacted by the 2019-2020 fires. And secondly, we have recommendations to enable better preparedness for future large-scale disturbance events, so that we can be better equipped to rapidly identify the most vulnerable invertebrate species and to respond the next time something like this happens. So next slide, please. We recommend that the 60 species we deemed eligible for conservation assessment should be assessed urgently for state, territory or national threatened species listing, and that parallel assessment under the IUCN Red List should be conducted where possible. In addition, the 209 species with elevated fire vulnerability, but with data deficiencies that precludes them from conservation assessment, should be priorities for research to fill deficiencies on key knowledge gaps, which can then allow these species to be assessed if necessary. Trait analyses suggest that although data poor, these species may also be amongst some of our most vulnerable, and this step is critical. Next step. Sorry. We also recommend the development and implementation of management planning at a regional scale to support the recovery of the species most impacted by the fires. Alongside this, we recommend the development and implementation of a strategic monitoring programme for threatened fire-affected species, and that's including the threatened species already listed, but also the ones that we propose for listing in this project. And the aims of this monitoring would be to chart species recovery and to refine further management actions. Next slide, please. Of the estimated 320,000 terrestrial and freshwater invertebrate species in Australia, we could get reliable occurrence records for only 14%, half of which were known from only 1 or 2 records. This was despite the inclusion of data from a wide range of sources. The remaining slides provide recommendations that speak to this. The taxonomy backlog is substantial, and with only a third of invertebrate species described, this isn't going to be rectified soon. To enable us to conserve the species we don't know about, we recommend management of key sites of invertebrate conservation significance, namely centres of invertebrate endemism and habitats of importance for invertebrate endemism and diversity. Included in this should be plans to mitigate and respond to future large-scale threat events at these sites. These landscape-scale actions should work alongside species-level interventions. Next slide, please. The second recommendation centres on increasing accessibility to invertebrate data. So we recommend the development of a programme to better integrate databases held by individual states and museums into a centralised database, including dealing with the substantial digitisation backlog. In addition to this, much data is also held by private researchers, and we recommend the development of mechanisms and/or incentives for individual scientific researchers to upload collections data to such a centralised database. Next slide, please. Finally, we recommend that the trait framework we developed in this project is extended to enable inclusion of data from more species, to allow the rapid assessment of vulnerability to threats, and to create a platform by which to assess, prioritise and identify species most impacted by future large-scale threat events, and to define the threats acting on them and the management actions they need. We recommend this framework to be stored and maintained by an appropriate research body and to be updated as new research and monitoring data become available. Next slide, please. So some takeaway points from this talk. Resolving data limitations is critical. However, the problems won't go away soon, and so decisions need to be made. We have a framework for assessing vulnerability, exploring threats, actions, and uncertainty, and it should be used and updated with new knowledge. Conservation planning at a landscape level is also a safe bet in the absence of other knowledge, but this should always work alongside species-specific interventions and not be an either-or. Many invertebrate species are arguably at increased risk of extinction, given the proportion with highly restricted distributional ranges, habitat or host specificity, and low tolerance to physiological change. Invertebrates are also crucial for ecosystem function. Given predictions for an increase in the frequency and severity of fire, plus the additional threats posed by climate change, habitat loss, fragmentation, invasive species, etc., it is important we can find a way forward to address some of the challenges and to more meaningfully treat invertebrates in conservation. Our approach that allows rapid estimation of fire vulnerability whilst incorporating data uncertainty provides an avenue for such assessment. These approaches will be increasingly important in a future that will likely be characterised by intensifying threats. And that's the end. Thank you.
All good. All right. So during the Black Summer fires, the media desperately wanted a quotable number of animals killed by the fire. And such numbers give people a perspective of the scale of impact, but they're often exceptionally hard to justify. And in early 2020, Chris Dickman made an admittedly back-of-the-envelope estimate based on the number of animals killed per hectare during land clearing, and that number was 1 billion. And incredibly, that number was quoted in the hit HBO show White Lotus. So clearly these estimates can go far and wide. But this number was later redefined in a WWF initiative to 3 billion vertebrate animals known to be affected by the fires. The key is that this number is the number of animals estimated to live within the fire footprint. But we know that, unlike land clearing, not all animals within the footprint can be assumed to have died, because Australian animals are adapted to fire, and it only kills a proportion of those individuals. So what we really want to know, and the aim of this project, was how many animals died in the fire. So what proportion of populations would be expected to die in a fire? So to do that, we conducted a global systematic review of all studies looking at tracking animals through fire. So we didn't exclude any taxonomic groups, but we got 5,000 returns, but only 31 papers assessing 43 fires followed the fate of animals before and after the fire. And what was very evident immediately is this quite large geographic bias. So the vast majority of studies came from North America and Australia, with very few from Africa and none from other continents, which is a little bit concerning. But what we did find was, just as an example, endangered northern bettongs exposed to a couple of fires, no mortality noted there. The same was true for the studies of yellow-footed antechinus and red-backed fairy wrens. All survived the fires they were exposed to, but incredibly, African bush elephants exposed to an extreme late dry season wildfire, which killed 18% of the herd. So quite variable, the outcomes of these fires. There was also a bit of a bias in the fires tending to be planned and tending to be of low severity, although we did get fires of varying severity. But overall, what we found was animals tended to survive during the fire. So overall, only about 3% of animals were killed directly by the fire. And when we looked at the factors that contributed to mortality during fire, the one thing that we found consistently was that fewer animals died in low severity fires and a higher proportion died in high severity fires. So about 2% in low severity fires and about 7% in high severity fires. So frillies, for instance, suffered 0% mortality during cool, early dry season burns, but 25% died during the late dry season hotter fires. So overall, we found that most animals survived during fire. However, a major caveat is that there was very few studies of severe fire, and only a single study studied mega fires. So that was the Black Saturday fire in Victoria. A handful of mountain brushtails were tracked through these fires, and incredibly, they all survived. So the data suggests that there's too few studies for us to be really confident that our predictions would scale up to a continental scale. So clearly more monitoring is required to improve our understanding of how fires directly affect animal survival. But it is clear that animals have all these incredible tricks of avoiding mortality during fire. But the overall message that I took from this was that optimistically, not all is lost after the fire. It actually presents this conservation opportunity following fire. We have really very little ability to control these or stop these catastrophic fires happening, and they'll probably increase into a more flammable future. But we can address the challenges faced in the post-fire landscape, controlling invasive predators, supplementing shelter and food, etc. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Chris. And we're going to move straight on. We'll take questions and comments at the end. We'll move straight now to Renee, talking us through the genetic populations assessments work.
Okay, great. Hopefully everyone can see. So this is work we did on genetic assessments of priority vertebrates. When the fires occurred, we were concerned because many of the priority species that were considered impacted, we actually suspected to be more than one species. And then also some priority species were probably, or subspecies, particularly in birds, were probably not supported as unique genetic units. And we wanted to ensure that those issues were known during the priority listing process. And we also know that not all populations in a species are equal. And we wanted to illustrate the importance of distinct genetic units across these areas. And this is particularly true for sort of low vigility reptiles and amphibians. So the first thing we did was produce in 2020 this interim report, and this report was basically a huge amount of unpublished data from university and museum researchers. I can't even give you a list of the number of people, but we did a genetic assessment of a large number of priority vertebrate species. And we identified genetic structure, taxonomic uncertainty within each of these. And we also identified specifically 32 species where we actually don't think there's genetic structure, which is actually a more useful bit of information than you think. And we also identified explicit areas where there's no, where we had very poor data. And even in priority vertebrates, you can see these dark green areas are areas where priority vertebrates even have very poor data, and most of them are mountaintops in rainforests that were affected by the fires. So, but for a huge number of priority vertebrate species, we had no real good genetic data, and we really focused on the taxonomic question and not the genetic diversity within species question. And so we generated or reanalyzed a lot of landscape genetic data to make it fit for purpose. And for this, we have a big frog focus because a lot of these frogs are highly affected by the fires. But we also did a variety of mammals, including things like potoroos and reptiles. So this is in progress. So one good example here is Phyloria puei. So puei was a hugely fire-affected species. This white line generally outlines its distribution, which is it's a mountaintop leaf litter frog that lives basically on 3 kind of major mountain areas. And prior to the fires, so this image is prior to the fires, you can see there's this huge anthropogenic change where all the valleys between these mountains have been cleared for things like agriculture. Now, when we actually look at the genetic data, we actually see that this human impact has already been shown with 2 different east-west populations split by the fires, or not by the fires, by the land clearing. And then when we look at the fires, the eastern population has much higher coverage of fire. So we're seeing basically the entire eastern population of this threatened species was burned, and very little of the western population was not burned. And when we look at fire severity on this group, what you're seeing is that our known populations of that east population actually were in some very high severity fires, which even though these are likely to be underground, we don't know actually how far underground they go. We're not sure about the impact that we would see. And importantly, this is a map. It's each of those by latitude and longitude showing the observed heterozygosity of them. And you see this greener yellower is better. And most of that, despite our lower sampling in that eastern population, shows actually most of the genetic diversity is probably in the more impacted eastern population. This is really important for a species that was considered endangered in New South Wales prior. Now, another really interesting one is the Latoria varroae complex. I'm just giving 2 quick examples of the type of thing we're doing. Alpina is a listed subspecies federally and in Victoria. It's supposed to be from Mount Kosciuszko, but nothing at Mount Kosciuszko is distinct. So we identify in the southern range one big widespread red group, and there's just nothing unique happening up in the Alps, except there's something distinct happening on the Hotham Plateau, which should not be the name Alpina, but we have to dig into this a little bit further. But it shows that actually that northern Alpina subspecies is probably just a alpine phenotype and not necessarily something genetically distinct. And while focusing on that alpine group, what we see is that there's actually what is likely an undescribed species in northern New South Wales going to Queensland. Interestingly, so this is from about Coffs Harbour up through the northern extent of the range. This only comes to the coast where the rainforest comes to the coast, which also burned. So this is really kind of a rainforesty, wet forest endemic species that we actually know very little about and was not recognized prior to our project. So what we're doing is we have a genetic assessment process that we developed in consultation with conservation managers, where we run pipelines on these genetic data. We then ask experts to make conservation unit suggestions, and we revise these genetic analyses and write draft assessments, which then get revised by both species experts and whatever conservation managers we can get to comment on them, which will then be finalized and published in a sort of not just openly downloadable way, because many of these things are of high conservation concern and even poached in a variety of ways. So these assessments are directed at conservation management, so the explanations are not going to be reliant on genetics background. They incorporate 3 key threatening processes for each species, and all those recommendations we're keen to have no unintended consequences. So if we're going to recommend like populations that might be suitable for translocation, we won't say, only this one. We will evaluate all options, and we will clearly identify all the experts who can help further explain the data and make further recommendations. So thank you.
Great, thanks Renee, and we will come back to more of that later, particularly in terms of next steps and timelines, for that work as well. But before we finish up on these vertebrates, we're going to hear from John and Libby again on the overall assessments of that were done on vertebrate species and the impacts of the fires.
Yep, I'll start again. And this demonstrates that Libby and I are both ambidextrous, considering both invertebrates and vertebrates. But thanks, Lib. Next one. We're reporting in the absence of Sarah Legg, and this project very much was coordinated by Sarah, and everything basically owes to Sarah's extraordinary efforts for this particular project, attempting to assess the impacts of fires on all Australian vertebrates. It's a phenomenal effort. Next. And it was a very collegiate effort as well. These are just some of the many people who contributed to this assessment. And it's extraordinary, I think, and heart-warming that so many researchers gave so much effort into trying to improve the conservation outlook for so many species after these fires, and were willing to do so in such a collaborative manner. So this study looked at all Australian vertebrate taxonomic classes, fish, frogs, reptiles, birds and mammals, and also next threw in a spiny crayfish just to be aberrant. The group of spiny crayfish just happened to be under careful conservation scrutiny and wanted to be included in this, well, the experts wanted to be included in this assessment as well. Thanks. Roughly 300 species or so we figured were likely to be had subject to severe fire overlap, and these were the species that we considered in detail in this assessment, of which maybe a quarter of them were already listed as threatened. Next. There is, again, much more information, a huge amount of information published by this team, including in our NESP report. And again, some of the work has been published in journals and will be so soon. Next. So what we were trying to do is essentially the same thing as for the invertebrates assessment, but with far more information. So we were able to resolve the taxonomic uncertainties thanks to Renee and colleagues. We had enough data for most of the species such that we could develop relatively good distributional models, and thanks to Darren Southwell and co for that. Given that, as Chris just explained, there's only limited data on the mortality in fires, we tried to actually get a better handle on the susceptibility of species to fires through expert elicitation again, and Libby will tell you more about that soon. And we wanted to inform threatened species listings and figure out what to do about the management, optimize the management to best achieve the recovery of these species post-fire, and to be able to be better prepared for next time around. Next. So these are the sorts of data that we produce for every species in this assessment. In this case, this is for the freshwater fish that were considered, and it shows each species going down this, each row going down this graph is a species, and the dark shadings is the amount of overlap of their distribution with severe fire and the light shading with other fire. So very many species were clearly, vertebrate species were clearly affected by these fires, and particularly those with really small ranges, most of which were fish, crayfish, some reptiles, some frogs, and many Kangaroo Island taxa as well. But intriguingly, and largely because many of the fires burnt such a huge extent of such a vast area of Australia's forests, some very wide-ranging species also had very high fire overlap as well. And the greater glider and yellow-bellied glider are probably the most obvious examples of that. Next. Lib, you.
And it's me. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how we elicited information from experts, because I think expert elicitation, in places can have a bit of bad rap. But like any tool, there's ways that you can improve the process to make sure you're getting the best information possible. So we used a structured elicitation protocol. So rather than just relying on, say, the most experts in the room, this process involves recruiting a diverse group of experts, because that has been shown to be one of the ways in which we can mitigate many of the biases and psychological frailties that individual experts are sort of subject to. We then asked experts to answer a series of questions, and we asked them to do that individually and privately. And so we asked them questions that included uncertainty. So we were asking questions, and we said, all right, what do you think, the population or the numbers in this population, what will happen? What's your lowest plausible estimate? What's your highest plausible estimate? And then what's your best guess? And then how confident are you that the true value lies between your lowest and highest bounds? And so this is a way of really mitigating against overconfidence in particular. So this is a modified Delphi process, because the next step then is to aggregate all of those judgments and show those results back to the group as a whole. So, and we do this anonymously, and we show them the individual judgments and the aggregated group estimate. And so this is an opportunity for people to share information and ask questions and sort of try and resolve some of the uncertainty that can come up. So that's the discussion phase. And at the end of that, people have the opportunity to revise again and anonymously provide a second round of judgments. And that's the information that we aggregate and use to inform the following steps. So that's the process. It's called the IDEA protocol, and there's a paper there that you can look at it if you're interested. So the questions that we were asking, so for each question that we asked, there's actually 4 questions. There's lower bound, upper bound, best guess, and confidence interval. But we were asking experts to estimate the proportional population change after fires of different severity. So low, moderate, high, very high, and an unburnt situation. Then for each of those at 3 time intervals after fire, and then for each of those for 3 management scenarios. So each of those questions were asked under a no management scenario, a current management scenario, and an ideal management scenario, where you say, well, what is an ideal management scenario look like, and what would happen if we implemented that? Now, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that we ask experts to make, so that they were all answering the same questions. But I guess the key one to highlight here is that when we were asking them about the future, we were saying, assume there's no fire of similar severity as the one you've just experienced. So if anything, this is sort of a conservative, we're asking for conservative estimates there. Okay, so we use this approach because it's structured, it's repeatable way of eliciting information, but you can capture uncertainty, and the approach, the IDEA protocol, is aimed at trying to minimise as much bias as possible. for a large number of species. And just noting, based on what Chris and Renee have been talking about, we don't have good evidence of how fires affect many species. The data that we have now might not tell us much about a changing future. So we don't have time machines. We're asking about the future. So we do need experts to provide this information. But as with the invertebrates, we can use this data now. So this is data that has been asked of a number of species, and of course next time there might be different species, but we can use this information to inform future vulnerability assessments. And importantly, we ask for uncertainty because we can use that to sort of target surveys and future research efforts as well. John.
Yep, so it's relatively straightforward maths. Our estimates of the total population loss of any species is the proportion of the range that is unburnt by the estimate from the elicitors of the likely population loss in unburnt areas, which is most cases going to be 0 immediately after the time of the fires, plus the proportion of the range that was moderately burnt or mildly burnt by our estimates of the population losses in those mildly burnt areas, plus the proportion of the range which was severely burnt times our estimates of the population loss in severely burnt areas as well. And that gives us an overall estimate of the total population loss for every species, standardized to 100, so that we can compare. We don't need to know the actual total population size at any time. Next. And this is an example for Kangaroo Island southern emu wren. It assumes current management. There are two essentially trajectories here. The green, which is the without fire, and the grey boxes or the pale boxes are with fire. So we're estimating here that if you look in the bottom left of the graph, that immediately after the fires on Kangaroo Island, about 50% or more of the population of this species, of this subspecies, is estimated to have been lost. It will gradually recover towards 10 years post-fire, but it still won't be at the pre-fire levels after 10 years. So it's recovering. We're predicting that it will be recovering post-fire, but that recovery will be very slow and won't reach the 2019 population size in at least a decade. Next. So we have this sort of information for every one of the species that we looked at, and these don't bother trying to read the species names. It's not really relevant at this stage, but we think that based on these elicitations and our assessments, that there are around about 80 species that formerly were not recognised to be threatened now merit being listed as threatened, and another 20 or so species that are already currently listed as threatened we think merit uplisting to a worse conservation outlook. And that would increase from the current listing of threatened vertebrates, terrestrial vertebrates plus spiny crays, would increase the number of threatened species on the EPVC list by about a quarter. So it's a really substantial change in that these fires have had to the threatened species outlook in Australian vertebrates. Lib.
Good. And I just got the same plot again, just to make a few extra points. And so we've already said this, the existing evidence base is extremely variable, and Chris spoke to that. But we can look at these sorts of figures, and you can see that, and you can see that by looking at the uncertainty bounds there. So you can see for a group of fish species there in particular, we've got really wide bounds, and we're quite uncertain about what the population loss, and this is immediately post-fire, is going to be. And those bounds just got greater for all species really as we look further to the future, which is not surprising. And you can compare that to, say, some of these bird species down here where we've got a much better understanding. Those bounds are much narrower. We've got a better understanding of what happens after fire. Now, the other point, and it relates, Tobias, to that question that you asked before, we need to incorporate uncertainty into these estimates to account for risk. So again, if we look at the fish there, if you look at the upper bounds, you're still in the white zone. So things are declining, but but you know, they haven't hit the either we think the species is vulnerable, threatened, or critically endangered. But in the worst possible instance for many of these fish species, we think that they are endangered. So if we don't ask for uncertainty and we, you know, simply take the best guess, we're sort of not allowing managers, decision makers to make decisions in the face of uncertainty and to exercise sort of their risk attitude there. So we should be being precautionary after these events.
Libby, can I just interrupt? Sorry, I forgot to point out that those grey shadings represent the thresholds for species having population losses for being listed as endangered and critically endangered, 50 and 80% loss, population loss. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, good. So we can look at those bars and we can see, you know, what sort of thresholds they, whether they cross a threshold or not. And again, we can use this uncertainty to better target research. So, you know, again, the wider the bar, the greater the uncertainty. We can say, well, you know, if there's a population, if there's a chance that these species are really in trouble, but we're very uncertain, we can use that to sort of target surveys and so on. Yes, thanks. So we can look at now, well, you know, what happens if you apply management. So we can start looking at, well, what is the difference between if we do nothing or if we do what we're currently doing and if we implement ideal management. So just to distinguish from the invertebrate process where we looked at it by threat basis, here we were asking about management strategies, so collections of actions in together for individual species. And you know, it's not surprising, we can do much better. So across the board, this is looking at different fire severities and the percentage population benefit with management across all of the species that we elicited information for. And you know, on average, that's a 15% gain that we can get if we apply more ideal management strategies. And as you can see from the differences in the dark bars compared to the clear ones, those gains are amplified as fire severity increases. You can break this down into those different groups and you can say, well, yes, there is huge variability across the taxa. So for instance, if we have a look at the fish, for current management, the population, the benefit isn't great. There's, you know, as we showed in that earlier plot, there's uncertainty around fish. If we apply ideal management, the gains are, you know, potentially great. So, you know, around 30% on average across those fish species. You can see where current management might be, you know, doing better for some groups, and for birds you might think that, but actually it's a few species where current management is doing a good job, and that sort of drags that bar up a little. And you know, you can look at these sorts of plots and say, well, all right, well, we really do need to sort out some better options for some of these groups, in particular the crayfish. So again, there's huge uncertainty there, but our current management, which is in many cases no management, is not effective. And then when you look at what about ideal management, you know, you've got some gain there, but not as much as the other groups. But again, there's huge uncertainty. So to me, that sort of says it's both investigating, well, what can we do? What are the management actions that we can apply, and how effective are those actions? So there's ways in which that research can be targeted to address those gaps. Now, we can look at this on a species basis, and I know this looks a bit crazy. So I'm looking at reptiles here. They're the species that we elicited information for on the x-axis, and you can see this bottom plot is the benefit that you can get from current management compared to no management. And the top plot is, okay, well, how much better can you do from ideal management compared to no management? And so you can look at the individual species and dive in a little bit deeper, and you can say, well, where is current management not working or not working? And you can see for many of the species in this bottom plot, current management is not doing much, and there's a few species where we are investing currently, and that's having some sort of impact. but then you can sort of say, well, which species are we not getting, could we be targeting for research? So looking, as I said in that previous slide, but being a bit more species specific. And so we can see there that there's some of those Phylurus species, the gecko species, where you would suggest that maybe we're not, even with ideal management, there's something else going on here, and they could be further done to sort of explore what we could do to help this species. There are some species that you can look at and you say, well, we can get really great gains. So the dividend or the payoff is high if we invest more. And so we look, for species such as the Guthaga skink, for instance. And then we can look at these, this other, the snapping turtles. I think this is where all the ecologists laugh at me because I don't know these things. But you can look and you can say, well, current management is potentially okay, but there is great uncertainty, particularly under severe fire. So Chris's point again. And so that uncertainty translates again into ideal management as well. So there is something going on there that sort of drives that uncertainty that we can try and unpack through research. So the gains could be great, but there is uncertainty that could be resolved. John.
Yeah, just recapitulating, I guess, some of the more generic results from this project. So our estimates of fire overlap for these vertebrate species suggest that about 60 vertebrate species have lost at least 50% of their habitat during these fires. And as a consequence of that, the number of species that are eligible for listing as threatened probably has increased by about 25% of the current threatened vertebrate species list. So that's a really substantial and profound consequence of these fires. But next, if you compare them to the invertebrates, then the assessment, the impacts on the invertebrates have been far more profound, far more substantial, and affecting far more species than for vertebrates. And I just reiterate that point in terms of bringing together the invertebrate talk and the vertebrate talk. Our assessments of both of those invertebrates have been far more affected than vertebrates in these fires. Next. Our assessments are based on the responses to these single fires of 2019-2020, which were catastrophic fires and had profound impacts. But the future is going to be characterised by many more such fires, many more devastating seasons. So what we've anticipated, the losses that we've catalogued here, will be nothing compared to the losses in the future. And we've got to recognise that we shouldn't be simply focusing on a single event and recovery from that single event, but on a future which is likely to be marked by many comparable events, and figure out how better to do conservation into the future under such a scenario. That was going to be my last slide, but I figured it was too gloomy an outlook to end on. So these are some of the positives. So many of the species, of the vertebrate species that we've provided data on and the evidence base for, are currently in the process of assessment through the EPBC process, and about 40 or so of them have been put on the FPAL and have been initially assessed by the Threatened Species Scientific Committee. And so they're in the process of listing or uplisting. So that's a substantial benefit from this project, the evidence that's been produced. Many of the species that were the focus of our assessment and for which we characterised as being the most fire affected species have received substantial and very rapid support for their recovery from many agencies, particularly the federal government. So that has helped to, I guess, fill the gaps between what Libby was talking about with current management and the ideal management. Many of these species are now being more ideally managed than they were before the fires. And we're building the evidence base for future events and be much more prepared in the future. Almost all of the recovery support that's been provided by the department and many other government agencies is contingent on that efficacy of that management being monitored and reported. So we'll know far better in the future what management recovery actions work post-fire than was the case after these fires. And key knowledge gaps are being filled, which is really encouraging. Next. Thank you very much for your attention and interest.